I've spoken several times about a mentee of mine named Gabriel, who is a great example of what I want to talk about in this podcast. And that is failures and eventually those that succeed. One of the things that Gabriel went through was he had 14 LOIs that during the COVID days evaporated. Most would have quit. He had letters that were pulling at about 30% and then for a year did nothing. But he kept pushing forward. He figured out together, we figured out what worked and what didn't work. Some of it was something that we couldn't figure out. There was a point at which it changed. And sometimes you don't know what that point is or why that point is. But he said something that is really powerful. And that is, you have to hang around long enough for the good things to happen. So you might want to write that down as an affirmation. And I wanted to today give you a few examples of people who were failures, not in their own mind, but were failures and then succeeded. Fred Smith, founder of FedEx, he had two major setbacks. Initially, his multi-billion-dollar company was a term project at Yale University. But his professor wrote, "The concept is interesting and well-formed, but in order to earn better than a C, it must be feasible." Ouch. That didn't stop Smith. He got funding, planes, people, and started operating. But 2 years later, after doing that, he faced some high fuel costs and a bunch of debt. And at one point, FedEx had $5,000 left. Still believing in his capacity to succeed against all odds, Smith took it to Las Vegas. And you know what he did? He turned $5,000 into $27,000, enough to cover costs for another week, and that's about how long it took for him to find another investor. Now, it's probably not the best advice to take your money and go to Las Vegas and bet it on blackjack, but it is a good lesson in being confident in what he had. Maybe people thought he was a little crazy, but he stayed strong, he carried on, and the rest is history. Oprah, done pretty well for herself, but after graduating from college, she took a job at a TV station. That didn't last long. She was fired, and the producers said she was unfit for TV. Turns out that that wasn't true either. So if someone tells you that you aren't cut out for something, think about where that may be coming from. Sometimes people put each other down out of jealousy or because they don't see the other person's true value. I'll tell you that back in the property tax days for me, we were a tiny little company and we were going after Fortune 500 companies, the most notably of which was IBM. And people said, you guys are out of your mind. They have reams of lawyers that do this. They'll never end up working with you. Well, we didn't listen to that. We pushed forward. Ultimately, we had an awful lot of success with that. Let's get back to some examples. Henry Ford. You know who Henry Ford is, I'm sure. But first, he was alienated by his investors for taking too long and subsequently lost funding twice. After the second mishap, Ford's reputation in the auto industry was abysmal. Most people weren't willing to give him a third chance. However, Ford was persistent. He eventually found backing from a foreign investor who wasn't afraid to take a little risk. And you know the saying, third time's a charm. Well, it certainly was in his case. Thomas Edison. This guy takes the cake when it comes to appreciating failures. Rather than use such a harsh word, he considered each failure to be an iteration. He's famous for inventing the light bulb on the 10,000th try. Think about that for a second. Something he readily acknowledged. When I have eliminated the ways that it will not work, I will find the way that it will work. Nothing's wrong with a little trial and error. Well, 10,000 times is a whole lot of trial and error. Colonel Sanders, Kentucky Fried Chicken. He didn't found that company until into his late 60s. He had worked for companies, he'd been in the Army, et cetera, et cetera. But if I remember the story right, he got his Social Security check and said, boy, I can't afford to live on this. So he began to think what else he could do. Ultimately, he founded Kentucky Fried Chicken, now KFC for a whole lot of reasons why they changed the name. And that certainly, in his 60s, did that. Most people would have given up. J.K. Rowling, Harry Potter fame, in 1992. She was jobless, penniless, divorced with a baby, but she had written 3 chapters of Harry Potter, which she had in her suitcase, and then she fled to her sister's house. She was depressed, but she kept writing until she had a book. 12 prominent publishers rejected Harry Potter before Rowling tried a small publishing company. They agreed to print 1,000 copies, 500 to be placed in libraries, and the rest, as they say, is history. Walt Disney, pretty imaginative guy, but he was deemed unimaginative. Before creating the empire we all know, he was fired from a newspaper for his lack of creativity. Steve Jobs, famous story that you probably have heard this, but Steve Jobs was at one point fired from his own company, Apple. But at a commencement speech at Stanford, he said, "What had been the focus of my entire life was gone. It was devastating." That's the point when many people would have given up or settled. What would you deprive the world of if you stopped striving for your goals? That's a pretty powerful statement. What would you deprive the world of if you stopped striving for your goals? And he came back to Apple, and again, the rest is history. So I would ask you to think about those people that have succeeded in a big way. Almost never do they succeed without tremendous failures along the way. But as Gabriel said, you've got to hang around long enough for the good things to happen. So what do they all have in common? We are all human. If you're feeling down and someone gives you some negative feedback, just remember, at this very moment, you have the power within you to achieve all your dreams. You just need to believe it. And I read a quote from Nelson Mandela. He said, "So many of our dreams at first seem impossible. Then they seem improbable. And then, when we summon the will, they soon become inevitable." Powerful words from a guy who personally persevered through an incredible amount of failures. So, think about that. If you're having failures along the way, think of them as iterations, as Edison said. Learn from them. Understand that few things in life do you ever get right on the first try. You keep going, you learn, and if your why is strong enough and you have a reason why failure is just a temporary setback from which you're going to learn, the odds are that you will be more successful than those that don't do that. If you're still struggling with the steps to follow and how to do this acquisition journey, go over to brucewhipple.com. The all-new Deep Dive Bootcamp is the best way to learn the steps, templates, etc. But remember that failure is part of the process, and you haven't failed unless you quit. Or once again, as Gabriel said, you've got to hang around long enough for the good things to happen.